Hello, I am Enrique Quesada, and this is Mexico Centered, a podcast from the Mexico Center at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. On July 1st, 2018, Mexican voters went out to the polls to elect thousands of public officials. Among these, voters participated in the election of all 620 members of Congress, 8 governors, a mayor for Mexico City, and the next president of Mexico. The president-elect, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, will take office on December 1st, and his coalition will enjoy majorities in both houses of Congress. A border wall between the United States and Mexico continues to be an important issue for the Trump administration as they seek to obtain funding from Congress, after also being a significant part of his speeches during the 2016 campaign. The topic remains at the forefront of national discussions on national security, illegal immigration, and drug trafficking, among other issues. We often talk about the impact of such a border wall on issues that pertain to the movement of or by human populations. Today, however, we switch our focus to other kinds of life that are an important part of the U.S. Mexico border region, such as the animal populations that inhabit it. How does a human-made barrier, like a border wall, impact the biodiversity that exists there? What kind of effect does it have on these populations' environment and their ability to adapt to these drastic changes? I gotta be honest, I never thought about this question before, but as soon as I read it, I thought, this is important. Why didn't this question occur to me before? But it did occur to someone else, so I was really excited to sit down with Scott Egan to talk about this topic. Scott Egan is an assistant professor of biosciences at Rice University and a Rice faculty scholar at the Mexico Center. Egan is an integrative evolutionary biologist, and his lab is broadly interested in addressing big questions in ecology, evolution, and conservation biology. Egan performs fieldwork across the Americas with a special focus on organisms in the southern U.S. and Mexico, and works with natural history collections in many major museums, including the Smithsonian Institute in D.C. and the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. Here's our conversation. Scott Egan, thank you so much for allowing me to come here to your lab to talk to you about borders and evolutionary processes in natural populations.
Sure. Happy to do it. Thanks for coming.
So I've talked to a lot of people about like all these political issues, economy, energy, corruption, impunity. But today is a different kind of conversation, and I was very excited from the beginning because it's about natural populations. It's biology meets borders and meets this talk of border wall, and so I'm pretty excited. So I have a few questions. The first one would be: so border barriers exist in other places, not just the U.S. Mexico border, and they have existed throughout time. So, what does the research tell us about the impact that they have on natural populations?
Sure. So you're absolutely right. We as a species have been building barriers across the planet over the last many hundred years, if not longer. And what's interesting is we actually have data on what happens, and we can actually learn from other scenarios, other situations, other geographic regions, what might happen if we were to build a continuous border wall from the Pacific to the Atlantic between Mexico and the United States. So the first and most important thing that happens in the biology of a border wall is that border walls are intended to reduce movement. And that's not just humans. That reduces the movement of individuals and populations among all species, animals, even plants. So it reduces the movement and ability to migrate to get to resources. It reduces the ability of potentially seeds to get moved by plants back and forth across the border. And that in and of itself has many then sequential or indirect impacts on those natural populations, because gene flow, movement of individuals, and the movement of the gametes between populations is a very important part of the natural biology of those populations.
So for someone who doesn't know about this evolutionary process and this gene flow, what is the result of these kinds of barriers? And in reading some of the materials that you sent me, there's also other kinds of barriers that let us know what happens.
Right.
And other kinds of barriers, like even natural barriers like rivers, but then you also have roads.
Right.
What's the impact that they have?
Right. Yeah, so I'm an evolutionary biologist, and there are major forces that control the evolution of populations. So we think about things like how much natural selection might divide populations. We think about gene flow merging those populations. We think about mutations within populations, and we think about migration and the movement between populations. So those are important things that an evolutionary biologist like myself thinks about all the time. And you're right, there have been scientists not only just studying the effects of border walls, but the effects of man-made barriers such as roads or dams or bridges or things that might put barriers between populations. And then scientists have also been studying natural barriers like mountain ranges or canyons or rivers. So we have a general understanding from natural barriers, from other man-made barriers, and then there's potentially some unique things about border walls and border barriers that might emerge from the interest that my lab has in kind of understanding these phenomena. So as I mentioned, the first and biggest impact is the change in migration and gene flow between those populations. And then some of the subsequent effects that can go on is, first off, if you put a barrier between populations, you immediately reduce the population size on either side of that barrier between them. So they have less individuals and potentially less genetic variation in those populations. Sometimes we call that a population bottleneck, where there's a reduction in the number and the genetic variation within populations. Relatedly, you can also have, because of that reduction in gene flow, reduction in genetic variation, you can also have an increase in inbreeding. And that's mating among individuals that are related to each other or share a genetic similarity. And that can be bad because that can cause inbreeding depression, where you have you expose some potentially negative recessive traits that are hidden in populations, all populations of plants and animals and fungi on the planet. But when you have a reduction in the amount of genetic variation population, you have an increase in the mating of related individuals, then you can have an increase in these recessive traits being expressed. So, for example, the mountain lion, which is actually distributed across the southeastern United States, goes down into Mexico. In Florida, those populations have actually been isolated, and they actually have suffered from these consequences of inbreeding, where there's a reduction in genetic variation, there's mating between related individuals, and they've had all these emergent negative consequences, heart disease, other reproductive issues that have emerged because of these negative recessive traits that are now emerging due to inbreeding. So the one way we can solve that is we can bring in unrelated genetic individuals and actually rescue those populations, and we're doing that right now to what's called the Florida panther, the populations of mountain lion that live in Florida. But this would be an ongoing problem generated by any barrier, such as a border barrier.
So as I was reading about this, there was this part where, as you said, if you put a border in the middle, you'll have these two populations that will basically, as they're not sharing those genes, there's no gene flow, they kind of diverge from each other, right?
Right.
And so I thought, well, doesn't that result in more diversity, right? in having new species, because they will adapt to their new environment differently.
Right.
And so maybe that's more diversity instead of less.
Right, and you're absolutely right. That is a potential effect of a border wall and a reduction in gene flow. And in fact, we've seen from other studies that actually occurring. So we have good data from the Great Wall of China, where scientists actually studied 6 different species of plant, some that are wind-pollinated, some that are insect-pollinated, and found that among all 6 plant species, there is now genetic differences between individuals on one side of the border wall, the Great Wall of China, versus the other, that have evolved over the last 600 years since that wall was actually put into place. So you can see things like that, where you've created now genetic differences that weren't there before. you can actually add on to that, not just due to things like natural selection, so differences in the environment selecting for different individuals. You can also just have random or stochastic changes where you just have some genetic variance north of the wall versus south of the wall present when you build the wall, and thus those are kind of trapped on either side. But what ends up also happening when you have this genetic divergence is you also have less genetic variation available to those populations on either side. So if there's a new environmental challenge, you can find that those populations don't have that ability to adapt to a new challenge. So, for example, climate change. If populations become drier or wetter or colder or warmer, those populations may lack the ability to adapt in the future. So it's an interesting thing to think about in both directions.
So it's like a counter force that it's like
Right.
maybe results in new species, but because of this less variation in their genes, then they might not be able to adapt to
Right.
this new environment, especially when a border wall is like a sudden change
Yes.
instead of a natural change that occurs, through an extended period of time.
Right. And the reduction in gene flow actually maybe even increases the effects, these stochastic or random effects, which we call genetic drift, or the kind of deterministic, like adaptation to different environments. It can actually cause those to have a greater effect because you don't have gene flow homogenizing those populations or keeping them more similar. And then there's another interesting outcome that we've seen from other border barriers and other anthropogenic barriers is that just building the wall or the barrier itself actually changes the environment on one side of the border wall versus the other. So you can have shading or you can have water trapped on one side, changing that environment. Maybe it becomes a little wetter. And so populations on that side actually need to adapt even further to some change in the local environment, in the local ecology, that would be greater than even just the reduction in gene flow itself.
Oh. So I was thinking about, currently there is a fence between Mexico and the United States in a significant part of the border, but not all of it, right? So I was wondering, is there... So in the proposed border wall of the Trump administration, it would cover the whole shared border between the U.S. and Mexico. So right now there's a wall. Is there any research specifically on populations in this border that there is right now and how it has affected?
Mm-hmm. So first off, one thing that's really emerged from the attention to the U.S. Mexico border and this potential continuous border wall is the number of species that exist along the border wall that are already threatened right now. So there are over 100 endangered species. These are species the U.S. has already identified as threatened and not doing very well.
In that region, in their border region.
That their ranges overlap with the U.S. Mexico border. So by building a border wall, those populations would be the most sensitive to these types of changes. So that's already an issue. And yes, scientists are working on individual species or groups of species. So some of the species that are interesting to me here in Texas, just reading about because I live here, are species like the ocelot. It's this beautiful predatory cat. Populations in Mexico and Central America are doing quite well, but the populations north of the border are not doing well. Their habitats have been reduced, their population numbers have reduced, all these impacts we're talking about, and that's simply just due to habitat change and other human disturbances. So we're already seeing those effects now. Those would be exacerbated by a border wall. And so scientists are studying the amount of genetic variation, how that genetic variation is decreasing in those populations. And of course, there are many other species that are also in the same situation where they might be doing well on one side and some more rare populations are on the other side of that border, and they're in fact being reduced further by anthropogenic disturbance, and this border barrier would make it worse. So scientists are looking at it. A really interesting one to think about is there's an owl species that can fly, that lives along the border. I was going to ask you about that
because I thought that was interesting.
So, you think building a border wall wouldn't affect a flying bird.
Right.
But in fact, the bird, scientists are studying like how far they fly and how high they fly. They actually don't get much higher than about a meter off the ground. So if you build anything that's higher than 10 feet, that would serve as a barrier to that flying individual or population, just like a beetle or a mouse or an ocelot that couldn't move across that border. So it can actually serve as a barrier to flying species as well, which is really dangerous. And that really brings up another thing that I've found really interesting, which is we, as a society, as a species, know these barriers do create reductions in gene flow, and there are these other indirect, potentially negative effects, but there's really not as much research as you would expect on what would happen between the U.S. and Mexico if we built that barrier. There are some scientists working on it, but not as many as you would expect. I mean, Texas is a wildlife highway for migratory species. So migratory birds that live in the tropics part of the year and live in the U.S. at other times of the year. Hundreds of species move back and forth. Monarchs, butterflies move back and forth. They can fly. We don't know what building a really tall border wall would do to any of these species right now. We still don't know. And so the fact that we just don't even know what would happen is also a little bit of a scary prospect for me as a wildlife biologist.
Right. So what, and I was going to ask you,
Sorry, I'm jumping on your questions there.
Given this research, right? Because I bet it's difficult to look into the future and know, especially when, like, the example of the owl to me, it made me realize that there's so many things I don't think about. Right. When you do something and there's this unintended consequences, especially if there hasn't been that much attention to these natural populations. So do we know, or you kind of gave it away a little bit of, like, we just don't know what may happen if this border wall actually gets built.
Right. So, I've talked specifically about how it may, reduce movement between populations. It can also, change behaviors that we really don't understand yet. So it can cause individuals and populations to either avoid that region, which would effectively also just further reduce movement. It can also cause individuals to change their movement patterns and do something different than they've never done before. So, for example, there's a border wall between India and Pakistan that's been built. And it has caused some of the larger mammals, which have now been separated from part of their range, part of their resources, their water and their food source, to actually move up and down the border walls and run into human populations, therefore increasing potential negative interactions. In fact, there have been negative interactions where humans have been attacked. The human population then kills the animal. So there's all these other negative interactions that are these unintended consequences of building these border walls that you would have never expected before you put them in. So you're absolutely right.
So animals do not have politics. They don't have that we know of yet. That they don't have their own governments. But we humans do. And I'm thinking, was there anything that can be done, especially when, since a lot of these barriers are for geopolitical issues, that, how difficult is it to do something since, like, you have to deal with so many of this other stuff that, we're worrying about human migration and workers and not thinking that much about the natural populations of land.
Right. Yeah. So I as a biologist and as a citizen of the United States, I certainly identify this as a complex problem that has many different issues going on at the same time. Our hope is that we, as a society, can think about more than one thing at the same time. And we want to highlight the potential impacts on wildlife. There are scientists and engineers and wildlife biologists trying to think about maybe less impactful ways of monitoring a border. That's outside of my expertise, but, again, border walls are being built all over the planet, so there's a source of information and data that we could infuse into our conversation so we have evidence and information to talk about.
There's a lab out there.
Yes, right? That's what we thought of with, the biology of the natural organisms is like, there's data. We first thought of the Great Wall of China. We must know something about what happened there, and in fact, scientists are studying that. So scientists are studying ways in which it could allow for movement, but still have national security issues identified. So outside of my expertise, but people are working on that, and we as a society should use that data.
And this data, this research can, be used by policymakers to think of other ways, maybe, to be able to protect both national security and this populations.
Yes, absolutely. There's a wonderful story. I just got back with my family from Big Bend National Park, which was devoid of black bears for many years due to overhunting and probably a little bit of habitat change. And in the last 20 or 30 years, natural Mexican populations of black bears have repopulated Big Bend National Park, and now they have a flourishing population again. So it's a really exciting conservation story that's related to this region. That's really exciting. And if we just had a wall between Big Bend National Park and the rest of Mexico, we wouldn't have this exciting return of the black bears to that area and that region, and a more balanced ecosystem there because of that.
I'm so glad that we ended with that note, with that story, because that's very hopeful, and that shows the impact of bears, but also what happens when they're, when movement is allowed for these populations. Scott Egan, thank you so much for talking to me. This was a wonderful conversation.
Thank you very much.
That was Scott Egan. That is it for this episode. Thank you for listening to Mexico Centered. Thanks to Lisa Wakata, our program manager, and to Tony Payan, the director of the Mexico Center at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. You can visit our website at bakerinstitute.org/Mexico and check out our Elections Resource Center. Views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the guests and the host, and do not necessarily reflect those of the Mexico Center. If you have any comments or suggestions, you can email us at mexicocenter@rice.edu. We would love to hear from you. Mexico Centered is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, and Radio Public. You can subscribe through your favorite podcast app to receive all of our new episodes directly on your phone. I am Enrique Quesada. I will see you next time.